Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to let the panelists go through and introduce themselves. I'm the moderator. My name is Marion Siebert. I am the CXO and co-founder of a company called Brightly that's headquartered in Grand Rapids. We have offices and folks across the United States. About half of our people are here, but we're a design-led, very research-driven technology consultancy. So I think I'll start with you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Leadriane Roby, and I am the superintendent of Grand Rapids Public Schools.
Good morning. My name is Joanne Roehm. I work for Western Michigan University. I'm Senior Director of Strategy and Operations.
My name is Marcel Price, but everybody calls me Fable, and I am the Chief Inspiration Architect with an organization called the Diatribe.
And he has a much better title than the rest of them.
So I think to get things rolling, we've had a couple discussions ahead of this, and a lot of our discussions were around how we can best remove obstacles for young people, starting as early as possible to help optimize education to better support the tech future that Grand Rapids is envisioning for itself. So I think we can start, Leadriane, I think since you're in K-12, can you tell us a bit about the biggest barriers that you see kids facing as they're growing up in the education system now?
Sure. The education system looks very different today than obviously what we experienced as young children, and yet in the same breath, it's still the same. And what I mean by that is we have a very, schools began with an agrarian culture, and we go to school about 9.5 months a year, and there's always the expected learning loss over the summer months. When you add the additional layers to that, what are some of the barriers? It's that our world today, information is constantly moving, and we have to look at education as a forward-facing kind of experience. Just comparing the last 3 years, prior to the pandemic that we've all experienced, our district was not a one-to-one district, and we were forced in a positive way, because things had begun to shut down, to have access points for young people with technology and making sure that they were able to continue to learn when they were physically not able to go to school. And that, to me, was a game changer of how we look at teaching and learning, and how we look at learning, because learning doesn't just take place in the four rooms of a schoolhouse. It takes place outside of the schoolhouse, and it's important when we think about what are the barriers. If we only kind of, think of learning as a static kind of, this is the only place that you can learn, then we're missing out that young people need to experience not only what's taking place in their community, but what's taking place in their world, and how do they interact with that. A barrier also includes kind of those financial barriers, because even though we were able to give some of the support with technology, we noticed that many of our families did not have access points to the internet and Wi-Fi, and so we had to add that extra layer so that the family could have access. And so we do a lot of technical work in education, but we also have to be adaptive to what do people need and be fluid enough to make those changes when that takes place.
That's great. Joanne, how about in higher education? What barriers are you seeing there?
Well, the most obvious one is cost, right? And that's not a problem that's going to get solved anytime soon. I think some of the barriers that we face institutionally as an industry, and then with our students, are actually very similar to what students in K-12 experience. There's the financial barriers, there's geographic barriers, there are cultural barriers, and there are kind of the societal norms associated with a 4-year degree that just by existing create barriers for our students. So our opportunity in that is to build relationships with our K-12 partners, with our industry partners, with students one-on-one, which is not a traditional higher ed model while they're still in high school or before, and really cultivate those relationships and work with them in a much more customized way to create roadmaps to their success in a four-year institution if they choose to do so.
Right, so Fable, I think this would be a really good time to talk about Diatribe, and since you're operating kind of outside the traditional K-12 college higher education, how you are pushing kids to get more involved, be more engaged, and how Diatribe is supporting that.
Yeah, so I think you guys have it mic'd up on the sides, right? I think so, maybe. I know I went to like sit down a cup and I was like,
Can everybody hear?
We got that.
All right,
Yeah.
great.
I just didn't want to have to baton. So how are we pushing kids to be more involved? The work that the Diatribe is doing. So the Diatribe is working to get young people to talk about the world around them, but we're also working to create new systems that we haven't seen. For example, the new space that we're working on, the Emory. It's going to have truly affordable housing, and that's not just terms of affordable so that we can get government subsidies to charge people what's more than actually affordable. It's actually making places affordable and then giving people back equity so that they can be more competitive in the housing market. It's creating a space that young people can go after school so that we can give them the resources that they want and that they need. And it's a place that will hopefully make our business district more walkable, because our business district is one that's riddled with blight, and the business district around a significant amount of our schools, GRPS schools, Buchanan, Brookside, there's also Hope Academy, all in this area. That business district surrounding it doesn't look the same as, let's say, the business district surrounding City High School. And I think that one of the things that we do really, really well is we find holistic ways to amplify the issues that we see going on with the community, because we do work really close with the people who are going to become higher ed students and the people that are currently K to 12 students. I think that the thing that we do is we try to have honest conversations with the young people that we're working with. And I think that when it comes to tech in Grand Rapids, a lot of conversations are around creating the space that the industry wants it to be, and less around investing in the people who are here. And Grand Rapids has a long history of doing that, of investing in the talent that isn't here. I think, for example, if we look at places like Ottawa Hills High School, I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but the school is drastically under capacity, right? There's students that haven't had full-time teachers in years, right? There's a lot of this for a long time when we were teaching at the school, half the school was empty, you know. And how do we as community come together and find innovative ways to pay teachers more? Can we utilize nonprofits to pay teachers more? You know, and I think if we're gonna give students environments where they feel comfortable learning and they're excelling in learning, then they're gonna be more likely to go into higher ed, and they're gonna be more likely to dive into fields of tech. But I think that as a community, we need to really invest in our schools. Like really, really invest in our schools, invest in our communities, and invest in our children. If we're gonna be able to cultivate an environment that's gonna get us to where we want it to go.
That's great. I think the point about, I think that's such an important aspect, that when we're envisioning the future and making Grand Rapids a tech hub, that nurturing the people that we have here already versus recruiting from the outside, I think both needs to happen, but in order to make Grand Rapids a attractive place to live and stay and grow a family, that education is kind of the heart of that.
Great.
And the battlefield.
Yes, I agree, and I think, you know, as Fable was saying, it's like, you gotta look at programming, and it's also the backwards mapping of that, so looking at what do we imagine our young people to be, and what experiences do we want them to have, so that they are ready to launch, so to speak, and then building that programmatic kind of components around those experiences, with teaching and learning, with mentorships, with internships, with enrichment, kind of interrupting again, I talked a little bit about the agrarian system of schools, interrupting when learning takes place, and learning takes place in a 24-hour cycle. And I don't mean that, you know, we are constantly learning, of course, but not just kind of confining it to the school day. It's how do we provide multiple experiences for young people, and then also having those experiences earlier. As we are looking as a school district, and even, you know, others in the education industry are looking at, it's like school can't look the same and then expect to have the same results. And in that, how do we introduce career opportunities for young people even at the elementary age? And that means that we're not necessarily tracking children, because I need to make sure that people understand there's a difference between introducing and kind of just that exploration that, oh, you like, you know, to look at worms, and so making sure that they have lots of opportunity to, you know, do things from a kinesthetic, you know, opportunity, or do some exploring with plants, or whatever that may be. And then in that middle school experience, providing kind of a little bit more of a on-ramp for educational experiences, and then making sure at high school that we're matching young people, giving them opportunities for career employment, those experiences. And one of the things I think about and I agree that looking at who we have currently in our pipeline, who currently lives in our community, is really, really important, because if you are only looking at recruitment from outside, but you're not necessarily having an investment of the people who are here, then when people leave, it's that constant, you know, kind of the flow through, and it's like, how do we build the capacity of folks that are here, giving our young folks opportunities for internships, and open those doors in a creative way, so that they want to stay here in the city of Grand Rapids. And I know that it's a complicated, you know, system, in the sense of, you want to stay here, but you also have to have affordable wages. You want to stay here, but you have to have opportunities for career advancement. All those things come together. You want to stay here, but then you also have to have a sense of safety and community, and that all plays into why somebody would stick and stay, so to speak. And the last thing I will say about kind of, as we are looking at how we are developing our youth, is those softer skills. And sometimes we don't always talk about, you know, we talk about the things that people have as far as certification and, you know, degrees and things like that, and those are all very important, but also making sure, as we're doing that real-time mentoring, to ensure that young people have those softer skills of how do you have and engage in a conversation with others, how do you have discourse, how do you push back in a way where you can still, you know, be a part of a conversation, and then also, how do you make sure that you're part of the space? And when you're not feeling part of the space, giving that courage and that agency to say, I have a right to be here, and I'm not asking your permission to be here, but I have a right to be here, and wanting to kind of, you know, interrupt places where that has not happened before.
And that soft skills piece is something I think we're hearing at all levels. Like, we hear it on the post-secondary level, when students go out to employers, technically they're fine, or they can learn the skills. It's the soft skills that are really at a deficit. Mm-hmm. So for all of these things, I think, because we're talking about systems issues, we have to collaborate better. We and more, right? Like, we all play a role in really making that change in our community, but we have to be intentional about working together, because when you look at the education, I mean, we all have a piece of the puzzle. We have to be connecting and collaborating and working together on these things instead of operating in silos. And I will only speak for higher ed, but we are really great at operating a silo. I mean, it's kind of our hallmark. Like we do our thing and we do it one way, and it's worked for a really long time for everybody involved until now. And making change in higher ed, and I would guess it's somewhat the same in K-12, change is difficult and moves at a glacial pace. And that's not gonna cut it if we all want to meet the needs of our community and our students moving forward.
And I would push that it has worked for a very select few, and then those
Yep.
who have learned how to, and I will do something that my grandmother would probably be proud of me for saying this. My grandmother was a sharecropper in the rural South, and she would always say that, she wanted, education was important, and she would also say, there are plenty of college-educated dummies. She's like, there are lots of people who have gotten the degree, but they don't have life skills, they don't know how to engage with people, and then we have to also teach how to navigate some systems and then interrupt when it's not working. The other thing I will say too is, we can change systems, right? Pre-K through 12, post-secondary, we can change systems. The hardest part is changing hearts. And we have to also work with our staff to make sure that people understand that how we show up and how we engage has a real impact on why people want to stay somewhere. People only stay in the places that they're welcome, and so we have to be, when we're saying, why are we losing people, it's like, how have we made sure that they felt a part of the community? And so it doesn't necessarily matter what industry is represented, you still always have a culture within your systems, and you have to make sure that the people who are a part of those systems are doing things that are evidence that they're being welcoming, they're supporting, that they are making sure that they are inviting discourse and conversations with those that they are serving.
I think one thing that's important to keep in mind too, as I think that you're all with different organizations at different levels, is if you guys are creating something, how are you creating it and who are you creating it for? And what I mean by that is, I don't know if you all are owners of companies or if you guys work in different businesses, but if you guys look around your workplace, if you guys look at your employees, right? If you guys think of the demographic of Grand Rapids Public Schools, if you think about the demographic of Kentwood Public Schools, is your workplace a mirror of the reflection of the young people and the talent that we have in our schools? And if not, are you creating something that is counterproductive to progress? A lot of times we use places like Austin, Texas, or Denver, Colorado is the beacon of what we want to become. But a lot of these places are just as not good for the same people that are a reflection of the people who attend GRPS and KPS. So if we're creating or striving to create systems that are continuing to not benefit a certain demographic of people, are we continuing to do things wrong? And how often are we going to continue to do things wrong and create things the same way and not create new systems? And if we do that, how is that going to continue to impact people in the worst ways? I think when I think of what I want to create, I often think of who is struggling the most, and I try to create around that. Because, for example, there's some of our students that, as you all know, you all went to school. You go to school for what, 8 hours a day, right? That's a full work day, not counting the homework that you have to do. Some of our students are working on top of that. So you're going to school for 20 hours a week, you're going to school for 40 hours a week, you're working for another 20 hours a week, not counting homework, not counting what you're going to school. I know a lot of adults that don't work 80 hours a week. So how do you expect somebody whose mind is currently in the process of evolving and growing to do what a lot of adults can't do? And if, again, we're not going to recreate these systems and do them in the right way, then why are we going to act surprised when the same people continue to fail and then we create things with outcomes that don't benefit the people who need to benefit?
So this is, the cultural issues that we're dealing with are complex, and everybody's responsible for them. what can the city do as a whole better? Like, where are we falling the most short, and what can we do better to improve the trajectory of what we're talking about?
When you say what can the city do, you mean like the city of Grand Rapids, like the business, or do you mean like people who live in Grand Rapids?
Great question. Part of the title of our talk is policy. So I'm interested in pushing up on that and seeing what you all think about what policies need to change in order to support this.
Being the most recent probably person who has entered the community, I'm going to defer. I have some ideas, but I want to also be respectful of, I've only been here 3 years, and I know that there's some long history, and so I will defer to my other panelists, and then I'll weigh in afterwards.
I don't know that any of us on this panel are policy experts, even though that is on, as part of the title. So I would just say that what you're probably going to get from us is a little more anecdotal and some of the things that we touched on already in terms of the systems around us. When we're looking at housing, that's a big piece of it. When we're looking at access to education, when we're looking at how we employ people in these critical roles in our community and how much they make, how we accommodate students that live their lives in a different way than what we might perceive a traditional student path to be. How we accommodate students who are working, how are we accommodating students who don't want to leave our community, which is actually the best thing for us. How do we reach in and develop that talent in an intentional way? Those are all areas that we need to touch on a variety of levels, including some policy to support that infrastructure.
I've been creeping at being in Grand Rapids for close to 20 years. I'm trying to work my way there. And one thing that always makes me scared is talking about the things that I want to see, because oftentimes it's people with the resources to do it and without the intentions that actually make it possible. But I'll go ahead and take a chance here and hoping that the people here, if you all see it come to life, and it comes to life in a way that's not respectful, that you're like, you know what, dang, I remember this guy sitting on this panel saying this would happen, right? And it'll happen. But in 2020, an organization called the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation put together an automated phone calling system that called, don't quote me, it was somewhere around 3,000 individuals in Kent County. And when they did this automated phone system, they asked them, should where you live be a barrier to the outcome of success? And a majority of people in Kent County said no. They all agreed that where you live should not be a barrier to success, right? In a place like Grand Rapids, in a place like Kent County, it should be incredibly easy to pass legislation. It should be easy to pass something like a millage, right? And when you use words like equity or inclusion, people cringe, right? Because people are like, oh, does that make me racist? Does that mean, nobody wants to be racist, But I mean, if you were to create a millage and have language around, and this is a really terrible example, about no neighborhood left behind, or about I care for the children, the I care for the children millage, right? And everybody wants to care for the children, But if you create a millage, something like that, where then those dollars get poured strategically into areas that are the most disproportionately underinvested in, you could create a change, right? If you created an emergency action plan around the schools that are closing, and we used our philanthropic sector to raise the dollars to make sure that schools that are half filled had the resources in the space so that students could stay there afterwards, and you turn schools into community spaces, you could then create those changes, right? We have a big enough philanthropic ecosystem in Grand Rapids to where we have a lot more money than we have problems, right? Like in a city like Grand Rapids, you shouldn't have homelessness when we have this amount of warehouses and property and things around us, we shouldn't have people struggling to pay rent in a city that was affordable for a long time. So I think that putting things like rent caps in place, making sure that landlords aren't predatory. I think, again, testing all the houses in the south side for lead and finding innovative ways to do that. Creating villages that make money come into our neighborhood in conscious ways. I know that we did work to ungerrymander a lot of the areas, but there's places like Burton and Eastern, Burton Heights. People don't know that that's like a part of the first ward, right? If you look at the rest of the west side, it does not look like Burton Heights. You will not find feces on the ground in a lot of these areas, right? But you will in the neighborhood that has a significant amount of schools. And I think making the neighborhoods a reflection of what they need to look like and making the schools a reflection of what people deserve, so that people can pursue the opportunities that they want to pursue, and getting really inventive with policy so where we can free up capital and make sure that it just doesn't go to machines keeping problems alive, but it actually makes it back to people, would be a fantastic place to start.
That's great. So we've talked a lot about barriers, we've talked a lot about things that we're doing wrong. What about what we're doing right in Grand Rapids that we can continue to do right and even do better at?
I would say that the things that we are doing well in Grand Rapids is, again, I'm a newcomer, relatively newcomer to the community, and there is a wraparound support. This is a very philanthropic community where people want to do, have resources and want to do the right work. What I also appreciate about Grand Rapids is that people don't really shy away from challenging conversations. Being from Minnesota, we used to call it Minnesota nice, where people would have, like these really polite conversations, but it was like hidden words underneath it. And since I've been here, and I don't know if it's because of kind of all the other kind of social unrest and other things that have taken place, people are willing to lean into engagement and consistently ask for accountability and transparency. And I think that there's an effort to do that, and I don't think that we always do it well, but it is part of ongoing conversations in different circles and different entities that I've been a part of, or I've just observed that people are leaning into spaces to say, okay, we don't want to just talk about it, we really want to be able to operationalize it and see it in real time. Because there's also a thing for admiring the problem, right? Where we can do, like what we're doing right here, having these kind of conversations, but then it's like, what are the actionable steps that each of us are committing to, our systems, our structures that we're committing to say, we believe this is what we're lifting up, and you're able to see it for people. And then you also have, and I'll agree with Fable, like you think about those that have been most disenfranchised, and we always talk about the absent narrative, those who have not always been a part of the community or have not felt like their voice has been heard, to think with them in mind as we are planning structures or planning programs or planning experiences for folks, because there's something to, if you support those who have the least of something in our community, those who have more resources will also rise. And so it's not about, when we say equity, it has to look different. Somebody who hasn't eaten in a week versus somebody who hasn't eaten in a couple of hours, equity is like, okay, I'm sorry, equality means I'm gonna make sure that both of you eat. But I wanna respect that the person who hasn't eaten in a week is probably a little bit more famished than somebody who hasn't eaten in a couple hours. And so making sure that that person gets different resources, because they probably need different nutrients because their body, needs something different, and that's kind of just the example that was in my head right now. But equity is looking at what people actually need and then adjusting the supports for that and kind of being that bridge versus making sure everybody gets the same slice of pie.
And I agree that those difficult conversations are rising up. We are having them throughout the city. I think the next step of those conversations is, are all the right people in the conversation? And by right people, I mean, is the conversation representative of the community, not just about representation in the community, but is it representative of our community? And then are the same conversations happening in several different pockets and not talking to each other? Spoiler alert, yes. That is, I mean, that really is a lot of what happens in our community often. It's well-intentioned, but everybody's trying to solve the same problems in different pockets. And we have to be able to bring that all together to really have impact moving forward.
I think my first two things will be non-serious things. It's really clean. Grand Rapids is really clean. That's something that we're good at. And we're really good at having conversations. We have a lot of conversations. I think that the other things on the list that I think that we're doing right, I genuinely mean it, and I think that all things can continue to improve. We have incredible parks. We have incredible green spaces. We're really spoiled with the amount of like green spaces that we have. Although, you know, Plaster Creek is really contaminated and it goes to our neighborhood, you know, again, like little asterisks of like that things could get better. But, you know, Garfield Park is beautiful, although it's like, you know, maybe we should improve the basketball courts. I like disc golf, but, you know, again, look at the neighborhood around it. Anyways, hey, we're spoiled with green spaces. Food, the food is great. Like, the food is seriously incredible. Like, don't pay attention to what the billboards say is the best food, but like, we have some of the best Latin food, like Thai food, like anywhere. Like, I've traveled all across the country, and like, I'll put our, his Latinx food against anywhere in the country. Hands down, we have great food, really, really, really good. And if you like only go to certain places, come to our neighborhood and eat some food. Like the barbecue, we have some of the best barbecue in the world. Shout out to Daddy Pete's. Art, we do a lot of art. Great. There's certain things that we look at as art that aren't really art, or it is art. But I like, again, pre-pandemic, there was stuff to do almost every single night of the week. Like multiple shows. There was places to dance. There were places to see poetry. There were places to see live music. And I think that we can get back to that. And we're starting to find our way back to that post-pandemic. But for the size of our city, there's a lot of art. The neighborhoods are really beautiful. We have really, really beautiful neighborhoods. I think that if you let the news tell the story, they'll sell you on that it's wildly dangerous, but Grand Rapids is really safe. If you've been to a lot of other cities, Grand Rapids is really, really, really safe. And our neighborhoods are really, really beautiful. We're great at systems. I know a lot of people who are in Detroit, and again, shout out to Grand Rapids Public Schools. I know every single thing that we can do gets better. I can get better. Our organization can get better. But if you look at the infrastructure of like the systems we have around us, our buildings at GRPS are great. If you look at like DPS, like if you, or it's not Detroit Public Schools anymore, but if you go to some facilities across the state of Michigan, like we're really good at creating systems. And we're really good at creating systems in Grand Rapids and making sure that resources get to different places. Also, again, while all things can get better, our political infrastructure is really interesting. I feel like I'm almost like trying to bite my tongue off saying that, because like recently everything that happened to us with ARPA and the Kent County Commissioners, but like they created a great system, right? It was designed, the way it was designed was brilliant. Shout out to Al. Again, we do things really well politically. Sometimes we just struggle with the execution part, but like the design is great. So I think that, again, we're showing that we have the talent and that we have the minds, but maybe that we can refine the execution.
So earlier we were talking about access points for young people and for even older people that are looking to change careers. So tech is a hodgepodge of people with disparate backgrounds. They don't, you know, because it's so new and because it's always changing, we get a lot of people that, you know, didn't go to college for it. Some people did. I think we're getting, you know, more younger people have access to college that is actually for a technology career. But you know, there's people that are young that want to go into tech. There's people that didn't go into tech and then have a career, and then they, you know, part of their career, and then they want to move into tech. How, for those access points and either like K through 12, giving kids the knowledge of what they even have to choose from and how to choose, and same for older adults. Like, what are the trends that you're seeing in those access points? Like, what's working and what's not working?
I think what is working and what we have to be really thoughtful about is how we as, you know, established professionals and adults look at the future. And what I mean by that is, you know, even as I work with, you know, teachers and principals, changing our mindset around, as a quick example, you know, we have to get our kids prepared. You might hear people say, we have to get our kids prepared for the 21st century. And it's like, you realize these children have only been in the 21st century. It's us. And we're 23 years in, right? It's like, so it's like, it's us that need to kind of elevate how we look at learning, and not look at it from a very, you know, linear, you know, point A to point B to point C, but learning really is iterative, and you constantly are engaged in learning. And so when I think about access points, it's about expanding our own mind of how we view the world. And again, the young people that are in our buildings right now have only experienced the 21st century. They don't know anything, you know, everything else before the 21st century. We're old, right? And we think about how are we teaching those skills that transcend, because that's, I think, if you want to have true access, it can't just be, I'm giving you a skill. You have to have skills, so I'm not saying that, but you have to have skills that transcend job roles, and that's how do you communicate, how are you collaborating, how are you encouraged to be creative and think outside the box, because that does, and when we're talking about technology and access, all those things have to take place, versus I put, you know, the square peg in the round hole and that doesn't fit well. For the adults, we also, you know, and part of preparing young people who will be adults as they go through our system is, we're not just preparing you just for this job or this job, but teaching you that you might have 5, 6, 10 jobs over the course of your life. And you might, you know, we want to build your capacity to not only just have an employer, but maybe be the employer. Be that person who can create spaces and different things that we've not thought of. And just real quickly, when we kind of label jobs, I'll use this as the turn of the century. If you had said at the, you know, the turn of the century, you know, 2000 into, well, 99 to 2000, you know, I want to grow up and be a influencer or a vlogger, or, you know, and think about like things that we have that we did not have at, you know, in the late 90s. You've been like, what the heck is that? And so we want to prepare people to think outside of what we currently experience, but give them the skill set to fall forward, so to speak, where you experience things, and if it doesn't work, you are taking stock as to what didn't work, and then how do you reinvent it, how do you progress monitor, how do you look and say, this is what did work, so I'm going to keep it and refine it, but what didn't work, here's where I need some help. And those relationships with communication and, you know, and working with others so that you don't live in that vacuum. And the last thing I will say, just kind of about like, for even the adults in our community, giving people the opportunity to recreate themselves too, because people don't look at work and how they engage in work the same way they did prior to the pandemic. I mean, you know, there's lots of stuff. You can be extremely productive in different settings, and we kind of got into that, you know, go to work, come home, that 8 to 5, 9 to 5, whatever that looks like. But work can continue in different ways, and so giving people the space and grace to recreate how they view employment, how they view what they want their contribution to the community to be.
Yeah, I think that to echo that, I think starting on one thing that I think is a little bit separate, when we're talking about access points, changing what professionalism is to a lot of people, like what I'm wearing is professional, right? Like I try to dress the way that I feel comfortable dressing and the way that a lot of my students might see themselves in, because like they should be allowed to feel that they can speak on a panel exactly how they are, right? In all of their brilliance. And I think that a lot of our definition of professionalism, or what is professional speak, really boils down to like white supremacy culture, and that sucks. I think that to amplify a point that was said, I hear all the time from my students, and then I cringe when I hear their parents respond, but they say, oh, I want to be a YouTuber, you know, I want to be an influencer, and the parents go, why don't you accountant? And it's like, man, I know some YouTubers that are making significantly more money than an accountant. But also, I know a significant amount of companies in here that have no social media presence. They don't know how to barely use Instagram. They don't know how to use TikTok. I got students running our social media, and they're killing it because again, they know how to use it. Like it's second nature to them. And I think understanding that, again, what do you normally pay your marketing department? What do you normally pay a marketing professional? Can you bring in some of these people, some of this talent, and utilize them and pay them for being themselves to bring your brand to life? You know, I think it's like thinking outside of the box again of how things look, and also recreating the culture of your companies. Like you said too, a lot of companies aren't fun to go to work at. They're like the work environment isn't fun. It doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel holistic. So I think again, making sure that your companies feel comfortable, that it's a place where people would want to go to work and they don't feel like they have to go to work, but they want to. I think is a really good goal to have. Yeah.
I think the piece around narratives around different careers, and I'll give sort of a different example as well, coupled with, yes, we need to expose students to opportunities, but the family conversation and the narrative that students' parents have is a really important piece too. So on one hand, you've got the social media and the everything that was just discussed. One thing that we are working with a lot is manufacturing and this sort of resurgence of the trades, and I'm looking forward to someone coming up with a new definition for that, because in a lot of contexts you hear like I'm going into the trades, I'm going to trade school, you know, whatever. Like a lot of us don't have positive connotation around that, right? That's in addition to tech, manufacturing, design, like those are prominent opportunities, areas that are growing within our community and nationwide. And you've got parents who hear, just like vlogger, I want to go into manufacturing, and into their mind comes this picture of what that looks like for their child, and that's not good enough, and that's not something that they want to pursue. So in addition to exposing our children to all of these different career paths and opportunities, we have to be having those conversations with parents and families and helping them change narratives about what their child can do and be and how they can succeed, even if that's really uncomfortable to them.
So I'm going to ask the same question about soft skills. We were talking about that earlier as well, how that's this overarching theme for everybody in all careers and any stage of education. What's working now to cultivate that, and what's not working?
I think with the soft skills, and this I agree with Fable in the, when we label things professional, it very much is, and here I am, because I would definitely be much more comfortable if in shorts, but here I am in a suit. And, as superintendent of Grand Rapids Public Schools, I know that I have to fit into a certain presentation. Otherwise, people are going to automatically make assumptions of how I present. And so having that as a place, but then when you talk about like those soft skills, encouraging people to show up as their authentic self. I think all of us do our very best work when we can show up as our authentic self, and it can be fun. And it doesn't mean that we don't get the work done, but it can be fun. And then balancing that between you show up as your authentic self, but then you also have to have the norms within your school or your work culture where this is how we're going to treat one another and hold to those things and be able to lean into some courageous conversations when we have agreed norms of, no surprises or challenge ideas, not people, or whatever those norms are, and lean into those conversations when those take place, because then that builds trust and that helps with those softer skills so that you can have a more courageous conversation when something has happened because you've built trust in your work environment or in the school environment and working with young people. I think that's important that we model that. And then after you do some of those things, because whenever whenever everybody's getting along, it's great. But really, to me, when you get a chance to practice your soft skills is when things are a little tougher, and then be able to model that for students afterwards to kind of debrief and say, here's where, why I said this, or this is, what this is, so that they can see your how you're processing the world, and so that they can also see people can have discourse without devolving into name calling or making whatever those things are. And so I think that's our role as educators, as leaders, to be able to have those conversations. And also, when I think about the young people who are in my organization or the young staff that we have in our organization, it is that they approach things very differently. And work should be fun. I mean, work is always going to be work, but it should be fun. And we want to have a place where people desire to go.
I think I maybe struggle a little bit with this question just because I feel like in West Michigan, some people's soft skills come off as passive aggressive or they come off as microaggressions. And it's like they feel like they're practicing soft skills, but in all actuality, like I'd rather just have them be like blunt and clear. But like I feel like maybe that's also like a cultural difference from like a lot of folks in West Michigan. But I think one thing that I agree with is the importance of like meeting people where they're at, and like listening for the sake of listening, and just doing your best to make people feel like whole, appreciated people. Yeah.
Being clear is kind.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like being clear with people is kind, and that's when I'm talking about like discourse, we can always disagree on different things, but being clear as to what motives or why a statement was made or whatever that is kind, so that people know where you stand. And and again, it doesn't have to be something where people are attacking others, but I would agree. It's like sometimes we all have done it. It's like where you might say something very politically correct, for lack of a better term. But I think also it's important to be clear with people, because that allows true growth. And if we are about growth in our community, we have to be clear with folks, and sometimes it might hurt a little.
I think with soft skills too, it's defining what that means, and in order to operationalize it, right? Like, okay, we're all throwing around soft skills. What that means to one person, to the next person, to the other. And a really oversimplified and sort of educational example is, we'll take calls all the time about people wanting leadership training. Mm-hmm. Leadership training? Like, what does that mean? And I'm sure whatever it means to me is not what it means to you, right? So we really have to identify and name the things that are lacking, and we, you know, we were doing some of that in order to be able to address them and advance from there.
That's great. I want to bring it back into tech, just since Confluence series and all of that. So tech is always evolving. It's always changing. New things are coming out all of the time. You know, being a YouTube influencer is an actually lucrative career choice. That can be. How can education or what's working well, what isn't working for supporting the education of students about an ever-changing, squishy thing like technology? That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. What are you seeing that's working, and what are you seeing that's not working?
Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead.
I was gonna say, I guess, what do I see that's working? I see people doing events that are showing that like e-gaming is like a real thing, right? I see people doing organizations that are after school programs that are teaching young people about technology, you know, and giving them access to a camera or a computer or sound design, you know. I think again, where I would love to see that change is one thing that I'm sure that we can all agree on is, again, we have this really wild, outdated education system, you know, that, you know, the state and the government restricts and makes to where it continues to, I don't know why they do it, but I wish that we got innovative and got to use a lot of these schools as a part of every school's curriculum, you know, to where, again, can students in Ottawa be doing audio engineering as a part of their curriculum, as a part of their grade, you know, can students there be doing, can they make a music video as like a part of a grade, you know, can they like, again, can we bring tech, can we bring all of these future states, video editing, things like that, into our classrooms to where they're doing the things that they're already interested in and then becoming proficient at it. I think that's something that I've seen organizations do outside of schools, but that I would love to see us be able to do in schools, so that when they go to higher ed, if they choose to go to higher ed, that then they're mastering those skills that they've already been doing and practicing.
And then higher ed has to be ready for that, which means that, you know, higher ed faculty need to work much more closely with industry, with tech, with others, to change the way they instruct, to change the modality of the way that they're teaching, and then to change their curriculum. And higher ed is terrible at that. I mean, we really are. We have incredible faculty and instructors who have been doing their job for 30 years and teaching the same curriculum for 30 years. And that's not everybody, and I'm not here as higher ed to bash higher ed, but I'm saying it's an opportunity to become more innovative, to push, to challenge, and to really get closer to our industry partners to understand what's changing and what's evolving, and to keep up. We should be the ones that are sending our students off with the latest and the greatest information, right? And it often works in the opposite way. So our instructors and our curriculum need to work much more closely with industry and need to be constantly updating and evolving what they teach.
I agree with what both of my co-panelists have said, and it is about looking at those who have the technical knowledge in that particular industry or whatever, and bringing them into schools, because they also have the life experiences. And when we think about how schools have been set up, you know, for high school students in particular, they get what's called Carnegie units or credits. We call them credits, and they have to be with certain, you know, by state standards to be issued a diploma. They've got to meet this. And there are ways to creatively do that, and we are exploring some of those different things within our school systems, because we want to make sure that kids not only have just the seat time and the book knowledge, but how do they have those real life experiences to work with a musician or work with a systems analyst or work with a coder or whatever those things are, so that they can take it to the next level. The other thing I will say also, similar to what Joanne said, is that you have to think, those who are responsible for instructing, they have to keep their skills fresh too. And so with teaching a profession in particular, we are required, all educators are required to carry continuing education credits to make sure that we are fresh in what our practice is. And I think that that's always a good thing. And it can be lots of different things, but we want to make sure that we're not teaching 30-year-old curriculum, because would you go to a doctor who hadn't looked at the latest technology in the last 30 years? Would you be comfortable getting on a flight with a pilot who hadn't done anything to look at kind of, all of the, and I'm gonna get myself in trouble because I don't even know what the things are in the cockpit.
The buttons and the
Yes, all of that. Would you feel comfortable getting on a flight if they hadn't been in, hadn't done anything to continue their education since 1992? So you see what I'm saying? It's like, it's important as practitioners of the work that we are thinking very creatively about, and then looking to continue our own growth edge and to continue to learn. And again, I think, as an educator, it would be crazy if I didn't believe in continual learning. It's like, I have to continue to learn and to push myself, and that's the work of our system, of those who are closest to the learning with our young people. They have to do the same thing, but it's how do you invite those who might be in those particular industries that have a different skill set, and not just necessarily the technical, but the more creative side, to bring them into schools and look at our schools very differently.
Leadriane, you were talking about equity earlier.
Uh-huh.
And right before this panel, you were showing me pictures of the prom dresses, and can you talk a bit about what is effective? What's an effective way down in the trenches to actually, the little things that add up to be a lot, that provides that equity and helps with the equity?
Sure. It's a lot of different things, and I think equity can't just be looked at from one lens. It's like, when I think about equity, it has to be, how is this landing for somebody? And I know I heard someone say earlier, intent versus impact, right? And so we all are usually very intentional about the things that we do, but if we don't look to see what the impact of it and how it's landing for those that we are in service to, then that's really not equity. And it's about looking at it from multiple perspectives and asking people to engage, because what you don't want to do is do things upon people, do things to people. You want to do things with people and have their voice and give them a place of, when you are really getting to equity from my perspective, is you allow a space for conversations to take place. And even though you might not agree, and even though it may not be, I'll use my children really quickly. They'll say, you didn't do this, and so it's not fair. Or, and those of you who are, have our parents in the room, that's always the word, fair, right? Where things are not fair, and because they didn't get their way, it's like, well, you didn't listen to me. It's like, no, I listened to you. We're just not having ice cream for dinner, And so, and I'm being silly with that, but the point being, it's like, you got to look at things from multiple perspectives, and then also invite the folks that you are in service to be a part of that conversation and not shy away from, or be a part of that work, not shy away from that. We're doing something like from down on high, and this is what's best for you. It's like, no, what would you like? And so even in our district, we're trying to transform our organization, and it's messy, but we're moving, and doing really good things. And when we're talking about having equity and having other folks at the table, you got to know that it's not going to always be real neat. Sometimes it is very messy, and then you have to continually engage people and make sure that they have access points. And And then, just really quickly with our prom dresses, we have wonderful benefactors and wonderful community members. The GRPS Foundation and the sororities and lots of our community members have donated prom dresses for our high school girls. And those of you who may have gone to prom know that, or have children who have gone to prom, that's a pretty expensive thing when you add dresses and jewelry and hair and makeup and that, all of the things. And we want our young people to have these experiences if that's what they desire. And having those girls have dresses where they can pick for themselves, and to be able to dress up. And I was sharing a picture where one of the girls said, "I feel like a princess." And that, the human side of me is like, oh my gosh, I love that. Because this was going to be an experience that this young lady may not have had if we had not done that, saw that there was a need, and then tried to provide it. Now, for some of the girls, they might want to do other things. And these were new dresses, they were some gently used dresses, but we made sure that every single girl that wanted an opportunity to go to prom, we were not gonna let that be a barrier. And so to me, that's equity, where you interrupt things where you're like, this is not gonna be a barrier, we're gonna have that opportunity.
Yeah, we talk a lot about, right, inviting people to the table and creating, making a seat at the table. There's people that don't know the table's there. How are people expected to be in the conversation if they don't know that the conversation is happening? And then if we are going to create conversations where everybody is there, probably not at a table, somewhere else, maybe in high-top stools. But we're really listening to what we hear, right? Like, having the conversation is one thing, and we've all said it in different ways. It's really listening, and not being afraid of what you might hear.
Yeah, I also I don't know if a lot of people really want equity. I think a lot of people want diversity because they don't want to look racist, right? And then if they have diversity around them, they're like, hey, look at me, I'm not racist, right? Diversity. I think that a lot of people say they want inclusion, right? Like, oh, I want black and brown and queer folks to feel comfortable here, right? Even though they don't necessarily make spaces that are honoring or welcoming to people, they're like, we want you to come here to live or spend your money or to work, right? We want you to feel included here.
A great statement on it.
Right, yeah, they probably have a great statement on it, right? Maybe they use it to get grant dollars. But a lot of people don't want equity, and I guess at least in my personal opinion, equity is about power, right? It's about a transition of power.
Yep.
And a lot of people don't want queer folks to have power. A lot of people don't want black or Latine folks to have power, right? That's dangerous. Oh man, what if they want to punish us the way that we punish them, right? If we give them power, will they do to us what we did to them? That's and I think that again, equity is about really being comfortable putting power in other people's hands, and doing what you can to shift power.
Yeah. Say that for the people in the back.
I think equity is really about transition of power and putting actual power in people's hands, right? To where people have the power to change their neighborhood. People have the power to change their schools, right? People have the power to change their work environment, to make their work environment more helpful and collaborative and holistic, right? It's about actually giving power.
And to that point, often people in power, why would they're not going to give it up. I mean, because the fear of why would I give up power? You know what I mean? It's like, that's a bold statement. And I hadn't thought of it from the equity is about releasing power. It's messy, right? And so I think when things are messy, people get uncomfortable because it's like, how is this going to end up. And that's that piece, that rub of, okay, I've given people a little power, and how is this gonna end up? And that's because then we don't control it. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective.
So power and money often go hand in hand. There's,
The American way.
education is getting more expensive, income disparity is getting worse. What are your thoughts around the possible ways we can remove the cost barrier to entry to education? And this is kind of an impossible question, but that's kind of why I want to ask it. We have to get creative, we have to do something different. What could that look like?
I'm assuming you're referring to post-secondary education.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because I'm like,
Well,
public education is,
yes, but there's income disparity in that too.
oh yes, I mean, if I think about the income disparity, I've been a longtime educator, and I remember when I got my very first teaching job, and so I'm gonna date myself when I tell you what my salary was. My very first teaching job, I was making $25,000 a year, and I was like, I'm in the money, because every other job I had probably made like $6,000 or $8,000, and so this was like huge. And when I got my first check, I was like, oh, this is great, and so, but I was almost $100,000 in debt, and so when you talk about power and money, you also have to think about every last one of us has had a teacher. Our educational system is the bedrock of our community. So you can't be the blogger or the technician or the doctor or whatever without having had a teacher at some point. Yet we don't put an emphasis on teaching. We look at teaching, and we always have, from a society of, those are jobs for people who couldn't do something different. That's the narrative that we give. And so we have to look at, if we want our folks and our community to rise up, we've got to look at teaching and the industries of service very, very differently, because that frames everything else that goes on in our society. From a post-secondary experience, there are, of course, grants and other things that are available, but I don't know that always those who are first generation college students, if they're always fully aware of those opportunities, and their parents are not always fully aware of those opportunities. And we make things so complicated, even things like the FAFSA application for, and so I'm going to talk about, as we are launching kids to have that post-secondary experience, we are very intentional in our district and districts that I've worked in, is educating parents around why they have to provide their income. And then if you talk about a cultural thing, in many cultures, you don't ask your parents how much money they make, and that becomes a barrier for people. So we have like structural things that we have built as a society that become that barrier, and so we can't be surprised by the results that we get of power and money, because we have these structural things. And then even something as simple as, because sometimes young people are benefited or blessed with getting scholarships, and what I would call a full ride. Understanding the post-secondary experience from the standpoint of even getting a full ride, there's still hidden costs in college. And so, to go to, when you're trying to reserve your dorm, even if you have a scholarship, you still got to put a down payment on that. And so those are some of the things that I think, when we have these barriers that are built in that make it inequitable. And then, going back to student loan, it's like, do we have to have that? I mean, are there other ways that people can go to school and earn their certificates or degrees or whatever without massively being in debt? because then starting their career from a negative.
Yeah, so like my magic wand would be, boom, doesn't cost anything to go to school anymore, right? Like you look around the world at different countries, like many things, America is the exception and not the rule in how we deliver post-secondary education and the costs associated with it. Just like the way that we do healthcare, the way that you know, we have there's a list. Realistically, to your point about financial resources, a Grand Rapids public school student in the Promise Zone right now could qualify for Promise Zone funding, so go to GRCC for free, Michigan Achievement, financial aid through Grand Rapids Community College, coming to Western and other institutions have similar, Bronco Promise and Empowering Futures. The sum of those things would make their education and their housing and everything else zero cost. I bet if I started from scratch trying to navigate through that myself, I couldn't do it easily, right? So in a localized small way, what we need to do, to your exact point, is how do we bundle those things together? How do the institutions work together to make it seamless and easy to navigate for the students? That's a small way that we can start.
Yeah, I don't have as much of an opinion. I didn't go to school very long. I went to school for a little bit. I was the kid that got suspended a lot in school, so didn't really have a lot of interest in secondary education. And then I went to secondary education for a little bit, like a couple years, and then Sally Mae got to calling and like knocking on the door, like I'm gonna need that bread back. And then I had to sell my sneakers to pay Sally Mae, and then I had a real big resentment. And I was like, I'd rather have those sneakers for sure. But I think that I would have been more inclined to go to school if not growing up poor and then thinking, oh man, I'm gonna become poor to do this. Like, it's just like a fear of staying in poverty. And it's like, I didn't want to do that. But I think now that I look back, I think, oh yeah, I would definitely go to school, you know, like I could teach for a living, I could become a professor, you know. But I think I didn't have that knowledge then. So I think that continuing to make school accessible, like they said, continuing to make it to where it didn't just seem like a burden of debt, or that you were going to trouble your family or loved ones by diving into it, to where it seemed digestible and accessible and actually seemed like an option that would take you to where you want to go. Yeah.
So we've got about 25 minutes left. I think I'm going to open it up to a Q&A session, because there's a few people here. I see somebody back there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Courtney. Thank you so much for everybody sharing your thoughts. So, Fable, when you mentioned, you know, the systems, well, I'll just say the systems are working the way that they're designed to work, right? The people in power want to keep it that way. I do think there are a lot of people in this world that genuinely do want to make change, but there seems to be a fear, especially in this community, to be the first. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like how do you think collectively we overcome that fear of being the first to actually change those systems?
That's a really good question. I think that you have to really get behind the people who are courageous enough to do, and try to be a shield so that there's not consequences. If for those of you who are from I don't know how many raise of hands are from Grand Rapids, people who are in here, so not everybody. For those that don't know, Grand Rapids is, I don't like to call it incestual because that's such a gross word. But, you know, the way that it's ran, you know, there's a very select few people who own almost all of downtown, right? And then next thing you know, there's a very select few people who are buying up all of the south side, you know? And the next thing you know, there's an MOU between the city and this part of town to where all of this development is going this way. And next thing you know, they're getting all of these state and federal dollars to develop this area, and next thing you know, it's the same people who are then buying up the schools, then making private schools around these places, and the next thing you know, less people are going to the private schools, they're going to these schools, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And then when you start to push against these, or start to refuse to work with these systems, next thing you know, you start to get political repercussions. Maybe you don't get $2 million in ARPA funding, right, because of the way that you look at the world, you know? Maybe people drive a stake in your career and you get fired as an executive director because they know the people who are on the board of your organization, you know? And I think that it's really important that we create our own systems, that we create our own entities, and that we get behind the people who are pushing against the status quo and really trying to make sure that they have a shield to where people can't just like railroad them. Because like if you talk to people in our neighborhood, like again, I'm not from the South Side, but I started to talk to people through the 49507 project, and there's people who tried to start first ever black banks in neighborhoods, right? And then got chased out of the city. Like they got railroaded and drugged through the dirt where everyone could see. And I think, again, it's really important for the people who are actually pushing to change, like create change, that people like dream with them. And work to create ways to, I always call it shake the tree so more fruit can fall, so more people can access the fruit. So whether that's wherever you're working, or whether that's getting behind people on a political level, just continuing to soak in as much knowledge as you can, because like creating change is really dangerous.
Hey, thanks for being here and talking about presentation and like just what is professional looking. That was awesome to hear that whole topic of conversation. My name is Alex. I run a tech company locally, and I'm really interested in your opinions on skills-oriented learning, because I joke about all the time as I evangelize tech, there's like this mythology of technology. We all have basic understanding of grammar. We know that 2 + 2 = 4. We can solve for X. But what is an IP address? Like we have no idea, right? It's this black box. And then we talk about building a tech hub in Grand Rapids, which is a silly thing to do because it treats tech like this bolt-on. And it's not a bolt-on. It hasn't been a bolt-on for 2 decades now. It is the foundation of the entire services economy and where, you know, the economy is heading. So how do we stop treating technology like a bolt-on and only talking about it in STEM? How do we bring tech into music, onto the soccer field? You know, Fable was talking about video production in tech, but it's, you know, how do we, you know, make it more fundamental? Because like I have a 5-year-old, I'm putting her on ChatGPT and teaching her about AI prompting because it's going to change fundamentally the way that we approach labor and the way that we think about, you know, just developing code, for example. So curious to hear your thoughts on the paradigm shift of like, do we treat technology like a bolt-on, like a certificate that you receive, or should it be a fundamental element like algebra and English?
I would say that it should be definitely embedded in our curriculum and how we look at the teaching. As I kind of shared earlier, when we went from kind of, you know, the schoolhouse into our own homes, the benefit of that was, if I had said to the teachers in my district, everybody's going to be on the computer and teach lessons from the computer, I would have had darts kind of thrown at me, because we have teachers, and this is not a criticism, and actually it's not a criticism of GRPS, so I'm gonna say this, because actually when the pandemic hit, I was still in Minnesota. So I'm gonna talk about my Minnesota experience. So we had teachers in our system that didn't know how to even use email, right? And so when they were doing attendance, they were doing things, you know, with paper and pencil and bringing it to the office and things like that. When everybody had to shut down, we had to take a pause and get our teacher skill set up of how do you use various platforms and how do you, you know, bring instruction into a different way because you couldn't be in person. And so that kind of was a tipping point for most educational systems because it required those, as you called it, a bolt-on, those who were intimidated by tech, they had to embrace it because there was no other way to communicate with others. The benefit of that has been, it has been a paradigm shift, and you are seeing in classrooms where young people and staff are navigating technology, and that lessons and the work, they are able to communicate in so many different ways. And even within some of our schools, I was in a school last week where they had they were doing 5th grade coding, and the kids, they were teaching me things, and so it very much is embedded in the way in which we do our work. And we are also allowing, when you talk about student agency, we are also allowing our young people to teach us because, heck, I can't set my cell phone. And you know, and young people know how to navigate tech because, again, this is the 21st century, and the only thing that they've experienced. And so young people in robotics and doing other things as part of their curriculum is really, really important. And then getting our staff and others to kind of embrace technology in creative ways as well. But I think it has to be a concerted, intentional effort to do it. So it's not, you know, now it's tech time. It's like, no, technology is embedded across curriculum and content and various experiences. And that also includes how we look at sports. I have a community member who talks about like esports as an example, and I think it is a creative way of like, okay, you know, you have physical sports, but then there's also other ways to have that embedded. And so it's not the compartmentalized kind of part of a school structure. It's embedded through writing, it's embedded through science, it's embedded through how we are doing physical space, how we're doing music, any of those things. So it's how empowering our teachers to look at their curriculum and spin it on its head, but then also how do they create spaces where that technology is kind of embedded in the content metrics that they're using.
I think in higher ed, often the resistance to tech being the foundation is rooted in fear and lack of understanding. ChatGPT in the higher ed space, I mean, people lost their minds for a minute. I mean, truly lost their minds. Because there was, I think, a fear of losing control of what people were producing and how they were producing it. Where they could have looked at it, but it's more difficult, as a tool and an opportunity both from the instructional and the student side. So I don't have the solution for alleviating that fear, but I think that's where it often gets stuck in the higher ed space.
Yeah, I think I started taking a bunch of notes down, and I started writing, and I was like, remember when we got calculators in school? And then it was like, remember when we got computers in school? That was crazy. It was like, remember then when we got the internet in school? And then that was a wild one. And I remember them like teaching us how to use Gmail. That was like in a class or something, or how to use a word processor. And I think that when I start spiraling out of all these things, I feel like that little meme with the guy connecting all of the dots. I remember there were teachers who were really scared because like they didn't know how to use a word processor, right? And now you got these teachers that are making, $45,000 a year, who used typewriters, trying to learn to use a word processor to teach kids that have short attention spans, like how to use a word processor. And I guess to answer your question, I very much believe tech should be a part of the curriculum, right? That it should be a part of STEM. That I think that we should have oh, instead of science and cooking, like instead of science class, can we do a cooking class and teach people about ingredients, and then students are learning how to cook? I think math class could be, oh, can we teach people how to budget? Like I think that we should bring all of these life skills, credit, how to use a bank account into our school system. And I think that tech should be an integral part of what we do. But I think that as I continue to draw these strings, I'm like, we need to pay teachers more. Because now we're like, oh, we want to do all these things, but like unless you're making like a teaching job a desirable position, like if you're like, oh, I care about tech, you know what I can do? Become a public school educator, right? Like, oh, I care about poetry, you know what I can do? Be a public school educator, Like unless you're making that a desirable job, a job that has great pay and benefits, you're never gonna bring all of this nuance into the system, because why would anybody want to be a teacher? To be poor and then struggle and to teach? Like you can't just survive off the love of wanting to teach young people alone, or else then you have Ottawa Hills when you have half the teachers filled, right? And then it's hard to get teachers in positions. So I guess my answer to that is yes, but pay teachers more.
In the back there.
Yeah, I think we're overcorrecting for tech. I just kind of feel like there's been this hyper focus on STEM for 10 or 15 years. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what's happening to the arts and what's happening to the liberal arts and humanities? I mean, they're dying. You're talking about leadership. You're talking about content. You're talking about soft skills. That comes through dedicated study of certain things. What Fable is doing with the Diatribe is focused on humanities. And you can't really separate the two. We seem to want to elevate tech, when tech, frankly, is the problem in many cases. And I just feel like there needs to be a deeper look at the education system. It's based on early 20th century thinking about manufacturing. And we don't operate that way anymore. And I just feel like people need to be thinking a little more deeply about how to think properly. And if you can learn how to think, you'll do a better job of understanding the systems that are impacting us. And we might be able to get upstream of some of these issues, actually find outcomes that we're not aware of, and that we need to be thinking more deeply about. So as we move into this new era of who knows what, because we kind of split the atom with ChatGPT, everything has changed again. So how do we think differently, and how do we get upstream of these societal issues so that we're not here talking about the same things over and over and expecting a different outcome?
I think I appreciate your expression, and I honor your affirmations, and thank you for your kind words. But I think, even though I hate when people say, I think it's a yes and. I think it's,
it definitely is.
Yeah, I think it is a yes and, right? Because it's like when I look at our students, right, I see them using technology to learn about these things. I see them using technology to spread information about these things. When our students were leading, when I know students who led walkouts of school, they communicated that via technology. They learned about that in history. Then they disseminated that information using technology as a means to do so. I have always been under the impression that technology enhances quality of life or makes it convenient. So I think that hopefully we can find innovative ways to use technology to embed humanities and embed the learning that people need to do into our schools. I think it's important.
I agree. I also would add that humanities piece is important. And so when you talk about the culture of a classroom, there's also always human synergy. And when you think about the advances of Zoom and all those kind of things that we were using, it's hard to read people's expression on a TV or a computer monitor. You can read people's body language, and we as human beings, going back to that interpersonal kind of connection, by how if they're leaning forward, if they're smiling, and all those other kind of things. And I think that also it's a balance of that's how you make relationships stronger. And so it's not just about STEM, it's about STEAM with the arts added to that, because that is a very much, that's another part of your brain that is being used to develop how you think and how you view the world. But you gotta have the human connection, and you know, technology is good in a lot of ways to make things convenient, but we don't ever want to get past the humanity of connecting with other people, and to be even able to give people hugs and shake their hands, and to be able to laugh with them. That's also part of how we advance our community as a whole.
Back there was next.
I appreciate your question, because it was a segue to my question as well. So glad you went first before me. I think that when you look at public education, higher ed, K-12 education, one of the interesting opportunities and challenges is that it sits at the confluence. My teaching in a moment there. It sits at the confluence of many different ideologies and visions for the future, many different purposes for what education does within society. I think that over the past about 50 years, especially after the Reagan administration and Nation at Risk, there's been a much stronger narrative on STEM education, because there's this notion that public education ought to be developing human capital and preparing people for the future job market. But if you go back before that, higher education and K-12 education had a much more noble and altruistic purpose of social cohesion, building fundamental literacy skills where people aren't duped by fake news, where people aren't bigots. There's a lot more noble goals and aspirations for public education. And so I'm curious, as we talk about preparing people for future job-oriented skills in the 21st century, where they have the soft skills and hard skills to be data scientists or programmers, how do you also valorize all of the other skills and knowledges and values and dispositions that make people tech workers that aren't bigots, that believe in basic science, that make this world like a decent and human kind place to live? And I think that these aren't skills that easily translate into a kind of economic rationality, right? Like, I think that you can be a programmer and also a bigot. I think that you can be a data scientist and a xenophobe. And so I'm curious, like, how do you still make space for all of the other noble and altruistic goals of public education without being totally subsumed by this notion that education is at the whims of free market?
That's an interesting question. I think from my perspective, so we're having real talk, right? And so how I view that is, Fable said this earlier about giving people the space when people are being creative and in kind of those interrupters, so to speak, to interrupt structural things, to provide that space in coverage that they can engage in real meaningful ways. And here in our community, in the greater Kent County area, it's not as much in Grand Rapids public schools, but what I have heard from other superintendents is even having talking about diversity or equity or inclusion, it's as if you are swearing at people. And so we've got to be real about, if you want people to be thinkers and reflect on how am I experiencing this as whatever my labels are, she, cis, whatever those things are. And then how do I also look at it from other people's perspective and not be afraid to have conversations. You can't catch stuff by talking about it. And what we do as a society is things that we're fearful of, we don't want to have it talked about in conversation. And so my job as an educator, my colleagues' jobs as educators, is to get people to think divergently and creatively, and we don't need groupthink. We have to have if we want to have a rich fabric of the community, you gotta have different ideas, and you can't be afraid that someone who doesn't look like you or have your political views or whatever your beliefs on anything, that they're now a threat and that they can't be a part of this discussion and dialogue. And we also, as educators, we have to balance that too, And so for our social studies teachers, that it would have been an interesting time to be a social studies teacher, because you can talk about like the history of like elections and different things. And it doesn't mean that you are supporting one candidate versus another, because that's not the role of a teacher, but it's to get our young people to think for themselves. And then also when they hear something, how do you verify it? So you just don't believe it because you saw it on this news channel or you saw it on Facebook. It's like, how do you hear something and then investigate for yourself? Because that's really what the role of education is, and I think that's what you're getting to, is how do we encourage people to be thinkers, independent thinkers? I don't need people to always agree with me or think like me. I want them to hear what I say, and if they don't agree with it, investigate it.
I would just add to that too, that responsibility isn't only on educators. Like, obviously we have a key role, right? But we need to be creating spaces in the workplace and in our communities that model that as well.
Yeah, I was gonna originally respond with something like snarky and be like, you know how we do it, we ban books, that's how we do it. But then I started thinking about what I was hearing Ms. Roby say, and I think that a less eloquent way for me to put that, and I think that I might lose some people here, is, you know, I don't like using the word bigots. The same way I try not to use the word racist, because it just feels like such easy language to grab. And I remember when Donald Trump was becoming president, I was angry on Facebook, and I was like, oh, bigot! Like just getting mad at people, you know. I think you need opposing thought, you know, and I think that we need to bring more opposition of thought to the table. And what I mean by that is, in West Michigan, you know, you don't have a lot of sex workers at the table. You know, you don't have a lot of people who are proud sluts or non-monogamous, you know, or challenge the status quo of how people live in a variety of different ways. And there's people who I would say identify as progressive in Grand Rapids that would look at some of that stuff as blasphemous, you know. And then there's people in Grand Rapids who would look at some of that stuff as like being very liberated, you know. And I think that without having the people who, when we go into a school, say, hey, you guys are the same people who break drag queens into classrooms. And it's like, no, we're not. We have trans staff. Like, we have non-binary staff members. Like, what are you talking about? Like, and then we get kicked out of classrooms for being wholly and entirely ourselves. I think where I'm going with this is, like, you need to bring in diversity of thought, you know? And at the end of the day, if people disagree with that thought, you know, so be it. But they're never going to see or experience any other ideology of life if they don't experience it. And I think that in the workplace, in school, is a fantastic place for people to be able to experience these things. But also, that's a dangerous thing to start saying, because you're going to get some mad parents, and you're going to get some letters written to some principals or some superintendents when you start doing that. I know. You got to try to find ways to do it in a way that feels holistic, and then bring in parents and bring in people, like, again, at the kitchen table, because it's more than just at the school and higher ed. You know, it's what are people saying at home. It's what are the spaces that you're creating in community for people to learn about all these things, so that their cultural palette can continue to be expanded upon. And, you know, if they take a bite and choose to be a bigot, so be it, you know, but at least they got to experience it.
All right, so we have less than 5 minutes left, so we can take one more question.
Hi, my name's Tom. Thanks for the great discussion. One of the things I've noticed over the course of the last 10, maybe 15 years is when I'm hiring people, they just want an instruction manual. They just want to be told exactly, how do I do it? And then just leave me alone. This is happening in a world where business, society, and technology are changing faster than ever and accelerating. What's a success story locally, where we're teaching our kids to figure shit out? And how do we become uniquely skilled at that as a
3 minutes, go.
So I would say what a success story is just very briefly, you wanna have people who have the technical, pieces of their job, but giving somebody an instruction manual in schools is probably the wrong approach, because you're dealing with human beings. And so it's about making sure that they have mentoring and real life kind of interaction so that they can do the very best job. So there's the science of teaching and then the art of teaching. The art of teaching is so much more important than the science part of it, because you gotta connect with people before they can learn and hear from you. And so that, to me, from my perspective, yes, you have, your instruction, your curriculum and things, but you also have to make sure that our folks who are working with young people are making those connections so that they can hear what that instructor is trying to do.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna try to say that real brief. Number one, I hate that. As somebody who's like a really non-traditional nonprofit professional, people all the time are like, oh, you gotta create a system, how do you do that? And I'm just like, man, you do. I don't know, you do. I want people around me who are gonna do, right? That's what I want. And then people are like, well, how do you learn how to do it if you don't teach people how to do it? I was like, you try and you fail, I don't know. But like, I agree that that's something that we do often. I think if I look at some individuals of success around me, I was going to share a bunch of like weepy stories about our students who like overcame wild obstacles. But I think there's a human being next to you, Javi, and then there's another human being who we work with really close, Erica Thompson, Kid Kane, who's Grand Rapids Poet Laureate. And they grew up in the neighborhood. They went to GRPS schools, nobody had a roadmap for them. Nobody gave them a roadmap. They went in and figured out life, and then understood that they wanted to figure out life by helping other people then figure out life as well. And I think to be a human being that makes your goal figuring out things and teaching people along with you so that you can pull other people up so that they are inspired to do the same, that's a fantastic way, because again, there's no blueprint for that, And one thing that I would encourage a lot of the people in this room to do is, if you have the ability to lift up the people around you, to teach the people around you what you know, and to do it patiently, and to give people grace, that would be an amazing call to action that I hope that all of you bring into your work environments and the places that you're at.
We have to get away from one size fits all. And we have to recognize that some people need a handbook, and that's how they're gonna take in that information and like, give me a roadmap, like give me a process, and that's okay too. But recognizing that we need both. So less one size fits all, more customized approaches for people, like we are custom and unique individuals at home, at school, and in the workplace.
So, did you have a
We have time, but I think we've covered a lot of it already. I was just as we're measuring, like, what is a tech job, there's a kind of cliche, like, you achieve what you measure. I think, like, to the gentleman's point in the back, like, you couldn't be an interesting philosopher right now if you didn't know a little bit about AI. So how we define what is a tech job, like, I think it's a spectrum instead of binary. Like, I'm a lawyer. My job will be irrelevant if it's not already, like by the time I get back to the office, if I don't know how to use ChatGPT and stuff like that. So I think as we're, as a city, region, whatever, defining what is a tech job for the however many jobs we want to add over the next however many years, to listen to people, maybe like talk about video and YouTube blog, listen to my son more, I guess, about like, maybe that is a tech job, right? And so I think we need to be flexible, right, about how we measure that, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe somebody's got some skills, and that counts for whatever we're trying to measure too. So, any reactions to that? But that was kind of my takeaway. I really appreciate the discussion from everybody.
I think all of us, have tech jobs, so to make sure that as we talk about things are, embedded in the things that we do. My training is teaching and learning. I am trained 1 through 6 licensed, where I can go into any elementary classroom and teach if I were to go back. But I have embedded technology in all the work that I do. So to your point, that tech job, it has to be fluid, because it's a very important part of our system. It's a very important part of your organization. It's a very important part of our community. And so you don't want to compartmentalize it and put it in a box.
Great, well, thank you for all for being here, and thank you to our wonderful